Syracuse football lands a stud wide receiver.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And folks, on today's show, it's a 2026 Syracuse football recruiting update. We are talking about the most recent commit in wide receiver B.J. Garrett to Syracuse. We're also going to go over the current 2026 recruiting class. And then later on in the podcast, I'm going to go over how the Orange can really improve its 2026 class. And it's going to date back to what I said on Friday about potentially funneling money towards recruiting. How about that? I think it's a good idea. And before we get to everything, right, you can leave a comment in the comment section below. Should Syracuse football funnel some money from Kyle McCord into recruiting? Because we're going to go over that in the third segment of this show. Before we get to everything, this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Let's get to the news over the past couple of days, and that is that Syracuse football landed its fifth player in the class of 2026, and it's Delaware wide receiver B.J. Garrett. He verbally committed to Syracuse. Garrett is 6'3", 175-pound wide receiver. And right now, if you look on 24/7 Sports, he is the highest rated player in Syracuse's 2026 class. But it depends on how you look at it, because offensive tackle Javion Cooper is a 24/7 Sports composite 4-star recruit, and he's also a Rivals 4-star recruit. But if you're just solely looking at the 24/7 Sports rankings, not the composite, just the regular 24/7 Sports, B.J. Garrett is number 1 and Cooper is number 2. So depending on how you look at it, honestly, B.J. Garrett is either the best player or the second best player in Syracuse's 2025 recruiting class. And by the way, it should be noted that B.J. Garrett is the second highest rated player in the state of Delaware. So kudos to Syracuse football. Delaware not necessarily known for being a football recruiting hotbed, but at the same time, you want to be able to maximize those states. Really, the word is monopolize them. Get the best players from each state, because there's still talent in pretty much every state around the country. So it's still good to get the second best player in Delaware. As far as offer competition is concerned, he held offers from schools like Duke, Rutgers, Maryland, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, and West Virginia. And based on the competition, I think this is a nice recruiting win for Syracuse football. Garrett is a Northeast kid. We've heard Fran Brown talk a lot about how it's very important that Syracuse football recruits well in the Northeast, because it's much easier to convince a kid from Delaware to attend Syracuse than it is to tell a kid from Georgia to attend Syracuse. You see my point? It's very important to recruit from the Northeast, as Fran Brown says. And so getting a Northeast kid holding off programs like Rutgers and Pittsburgh is a big deal. Also holding off ACC schools like Duke, Pitt, and Virginia Tech, that's important as well. So this is a nice recruiting win for Fran Brown and Syracuse, getting a guy like B.J. Garrett. And don't worry, we're going to get to the scouting report in just a moment. But I want to point this out. I think we all want, most of you guys who are watching or listening to this podcast are Syracuse fans. You want Syracuse to sit at the big boy table. You want them to be in on these 5 stars, these 4-star players, right? And Syracuse with Fran Brown has done that at times. We saw them get in 2025 4-star consensus Demetrius Samuel. They also held off Michigan for the number 1 player in New York. In 2025, Quante Gillians, a defensive lineman, is his name. I believe that's how you say it. But it's very hard, let's be honest, for a program like Syracuse to consistently sit at the big boy table. It's hard You're going up against those big-time programs like Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia. It's not exactly easy to sit there, right? In order for Syracuse to have sustained, solid recruiting, as we have seen under Fran Brown, and we will get to realistic, obtainable goals later on in the podcast. But Fran Brown so far has done a nice job of at least getting Syracuse to be a slightly above average recruiting team in the ACC. And he's doing it simply by recruiting in his backyard. And occasionally he'll get a 4-star player to commit. But if he gets a 3-star, he's okay with getting a higher rated 3-star and holding off ACC competition. So overall, this is a nice, solid recruiting win for Syracuse football. Now let's get to the scouting report of BJ Garrett. Okay. And I really like BJ Garrett. Here is what Garrett has said about himself when describing himself as a player. I'll paraphrase it for you all. He describes himself as a strong route runner with a strong route tree, and he has a great catch radius. Now, I also went back and I watched his highlights on 24/7 Sports. I watched them, and highlights can be a little bit misleading. Remember that these are some of the best athletes in high school, so when they're going up against high school competition, they're going to look good. They're going to look like insert your favorite NFL wide receiver, because these guys are just so much better than the competition they're going up against. So I tried to look carefully, and he's pretty much spot on about himself. He's not lying about who he is. He can leave defenders in the dust, obviously, with his speed in high school. He's got good route running, and he can go out and make those tough catches if a quarterback makes an inaccurate throw. That's what a good catch radius is all about. My player comparison, it's actually kind of freaky because they both have a very similar frame. They're both 6'3", 170-ish pounds. My player comp for BJ Garrett is actually Daryl Gill, a current Syracuse wide receiver who took a nice step last year and I think could take a bigger step in 2025. I already mentioned that they have similar build, but if you think of a guy like Daryl Gill, he's a versatile outside wide receiver. He's got nice hands. He's a strong route runner. He can run after the catch. He can take the top off the defense. Basically, he can do a little bit of everything. When I watched BJ Garrett on 24/7 Sports, some of his highlight tape, it looked pretty similar to Daryl Gill. If you watched his tape, feel free to let me know your player comp in the comments section below. But that's what I got from it. And I tried to be somewhat realistic. I saw someone online compare him to Andre Johnson. I think that's a little bit unfair. Andre Johnson is a Hall of Fame NFL wide receiver. So I said Daryl Gill. He looks kind of like Daryl Gill. And they have the exact same frame, ironically. I'm Jackson Holzer. This is Locked On Syracuse. And on today's episode, we are going over 2026 football recruiting. The big news over the last couple of days is wide receiver BJ Garrett, a 3-star, the number 2 player in Delaware, verbally committed to Syracuse. I just told you guys the offers that he had, a scouting report of him. And now coming up, let's go over the current 2026 class and some of the goals that the Orange should have for that class. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a Intuit TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress. And you get the most money back guaranteed. All while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now, this is Taxes, Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are going over Syracuse football 2026 recruiting. We just went over BJ Garrett, the number 2 overall player in the state of Delaware, committing to Syracuse the other day. Awesome recruiting win for the Orange. Now let's go over the current 2026 recruiting class. Overall, I would say that the Orange are off to a pretty strong start in 2026. They currently have 5 verbal commitments, which is not an overwhelming total, but it's certainly on par with plenty of programs around the country. And currently, Syracuse has the 18th rated class, so top 20 in the country per 24/7 Sports, and it's top 3 currently in the ACC. Now, it's early. So, obviously, it's nice to look at the recruiting rankings and be like, wow, they're 18th. That's pretty high. It's early. Give it a little bit of time, all right? Having said that, not to be negative Nancy over here, it's certainly better to be 18th at this point of the game than it is to be 58th. It means you're off to a relatively good start, right? That's why I say they're off to a solid start. And I think that a realistic, obtainable goal for Syracuse moving forward in football recruiting is to finish top 5 in the conference. I think there are 3 schools that are going to be particularly difficult to beat in recruiting in a year in and year out basis. Clemson with Dabo Swinney, they are always going to have a top class in the ACC. You got Miami with their big budget, South Florida. Florida's a recruiting hotbed as well. It's going to be tough to beat them in recruiting, right? And then also Florida State. Now, it's fun to dunk on the Florida State program, especially after the hissy fit that they threw last season and suing everyone that they could. It's all fun and games, right? To dunk on Florida State. And obviously they had an absolutely brutal season going 2-10. And trust me, that is like the one team in the ACC that I will not root for in football because it was objectively hilarious to watch them go 2-10. But in all seriousness, if we're having an honest conversation here, right? It's hard to beat out Florida State in recruiting. Why? They are in the state of Florida where a lot of football recruits reside. They got a big time budget, and it's Florida State. They're typically good year in and year out. They just had a terrible year. So those 3 schools really, it's Clemson, Miami, Florida State. Usually on a year in and year out basis, those are going to be the top 3 schools in recruiting. After that, though, 4 and 5 are up for grabs. And if you look at where Syracuse football has finished in recruiting over the last couple of seasons under Fran Brown, you would come to realize that they don't have to go that far up in order to crack the top 5 in the conference. Both years under Fran Brown, 2024 and 2025 football recruiting, they have finished upper half in the ACC. And last year, they were 7th. Or actually, I shouldn't say last year. This current year, 2025, they were 7th in the conference. Going from 7 to 5 is not a big jump. Granted, you're going to have competition. SMU certainly seems like a program on the rise. Georgia Tech just landed a monster 2025 recruiting class. Louisville could sneak in, year out, right? And if I'm missing a school here or there, my apologies, okay? I'm not meaning to disrespect you, but you get the idea. There's competition. It's just not the same as Miami, Clemson, Florida State in recruiting. So I think going forward, a realistic, obtainable goal in football recruiting for Syracuse is to finish top 5 in the ACC under Fran Brown. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Should Syracuse aim higher? I mean, obviously they should, but do you think they can get higher than that? Leave your thought in the comment section below. About the Syracuse class itself, Syracuse landed its first wide receiver in 2026 in BJ Garrett, a nice get over there, obviously. Hang on Maurice Medley, though. I'll get to him in just a moment because he's actually a defender. And Syracuse football has now recruited 2 defenders in the class of 2026. So let's start off with Maurice Medley. He's actually rated as a 3-star wide receiver from Baltimore, Maryland. That's where 24/7 Sports has him from Baltimore, Maryland. But Syracuse actually recruited him as a defender. He's 6'3", 215 pounds, and he actually also plays linebacker in high school. And when I think of the fact that he's a wide receiver and a linebacker, it makes me think of one particular player that now used to play for Syracuse. and that's Justin Barron. Justin Barron is a very similar frame. Syracuse's website had him listed at 6'4", 225. So if Maurice Medley puts on, let's say, 10 to 15 pounds, and that's still a little bit small to be a linebacker, but a little bit big to be a defensive back. So he would kind of be that hybrid linebacker or defensive back in college. I'd love to hear your thought on that in the comment section below. But when I think of the fact that Syracuse wants to use him as a defender, I think of the fact that they might have a Justin Barron in vision with a guy like Maurice Medley. The other defender in Syracuse's 2026 recruiting class is Jackson Gates, a 3-star defensive back from California, who we also did a 10 to 15 minute mini podcast on. Other offensive players, there's 2 more aside from BJ Garrett. You got the big win. Depending on how you look at it, like I said in the first segment of the show, could be either the best or the second best recruit in the class. You got 24/7 Sports composite 4-star recruit and Rivals 4-star recruit, offensive tackle Javion Cooper. Not only is it a big win that it's a big-time recruit, a 4-star guy, but it's also from the fact that you got him out of the state of Florida, similar to Demetrius Samuel. It's not necessarily easy getting a guy from Florida to come to Syracuse. Believe me, I know. You know why? Funny story. I grew up in South Florida. I only went to Syracuse because they had a great broadcasting program. If I wasn't getting into broadcasting, I wasn't going to go to Syracuse. It's not easy to convince a kid from South Florida or wherever he's from in Florida to go up to a school up north in general. Usually people want to stay closer to home, so it's a very solid get getting a guy like Javion Cooper. Having said that, I believe if you look back on that mini podcast we did on Javion Cooper, he's got some sort of family relation with Syracuse. It might have been his mother that is from the area. And so that's why I think Syracuse had some sort of advantage with getting a guy like Javion Cooper. As far as the other running back, or this guy is a running back, but as far as the other offensive player to mention in Syracuse's 2026 class, you got Deontay Sheffy from Pennsylvania. Sheffy has been committed to Syracuse for a long, long time. If you recall, he was one of the original 3 in Syracuse's 2026 class. Can you guess what the original 3 was? Deontay Sheffy was 1. Demetrius Samuel was originally in Syracuse's 2026 class. But then, if you recall his journey, he decommitted from the Orange. He reclassified to 2025 and committed to Florida, and then decided to flip back to Syracuse and stayed in the 2025 class. So it all worked out in the end for a guy like Demetrius Samuel. But the third member of that original 3 was linebacker Isaiah Williams. That's who it was. Can you believe that? Deontay Sheffy has been around for a while with the Orange. So kudos to him. But he is the other running back. He's from Pennsylvania. Hopefully Penn State does not get involved. When Penn State gets involved for a player from Pennsylvania, typically they get him, right? But as long as Penn State doesn't get involved for a guy like Deontay Sheffy, I think he will ultimately stick with Syracuse. So as it stands right now, the Orange have 5 players in their 2026 recruiting class. You got BJ Garrett, who we have talked a lot about here on this podcast now. You got 2 defenders. You got Jackson Gates and Maurice Medley. And then you got Javion Cooper and Deontay Sheffy as other offensive players. What are your thoughts on Syracuse's 2026 recruiting class? I'd love to hear them in the comment section below, because coming up, we're going to talk about improving the 2026 recruiting class. So stick with me here on Locked On Syracuse. Attending the new 12-team college football playoff games is an incredible experience that brings fans together like never before. I remember the excitement of past playoff games and can't wait to make new memories with the updated format and extra teams involved. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I used Game Time Picks to find tickets for an upcoming game. Browsing through the deals was a breeze, and I found great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. The Super Deal in particular stood out as the best value for the event. I love that I could see the seat views before buying, and that the app shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Plus, the on-time ticket delivery and lowest price guarantee gave me complete peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege. For $20 off your first purchase, terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege. LockkedOnCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. When Kyle McCord declared for the NFL draft on Friday, we had a conversation on the fact that, hey, Syracuse football had all this NIL money waiting in case Kyle McCord did in fact return to Syracuse. Because after all, as much as we all love Kyle McCord and Kyle McCord loves Syracuse, he's not going to come and play for free. Obviously, he's going to have to get paid. And so the Orange, because there was a chance that he could come back, had this NIL money supposedly waiting for him. Now that he decides to go to the NFL, and it seems like he's going to stick in the NFL based on the fact that he said that, hey, he got the feedback from the NFL he was looking for. It had nothing to do with the NCAA making a ruling on eligibility. It was everything to do with the feedback he got from the NFL, which goes to tell you that it's probably worth it for him to go to the NFL. So with that being said, we had a conversation about, hey, Syracuse could use this NIL money that they were going to spend on Kyle McCord, and they can funnel it into the 2025 transfer portal, right? Makes a lot of sense because there are still some needs that Syracuse has in the portal. Still need to figure out your offensive line. You definitely need to add a linebacker. You definitely need to add some sort of defensive back, whether it's a corner or a safety if you're going to make some sort of position switch. There's obviously some needs that Syracuse needs to still address in the portal, so why not use that NIL money for it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, there was something that I really didn't consider when having that conversation with you all, and that is, what if they decide to use it for 2026 recruiting? What about that? How about that strategy? See, let's say that Syracuse football doesn't want to overpay for portal players. They might like a portal player, but let's be honest. Syracuse is not in any sort of position to be wasting money. So if they feel that a player is not worth what they are asking for, it really does not make sense to overpay them, especially when you're a program, let's be honest, like Syracuse, without an unlimited budget. They do not have an unlimited budget. That's okay. You can still win games, but you do not have an unlimited budget. It just means you got to be a little bit more careful with your money. And so if Syracuse doesn't want to overpay on portal players in 2025, then what can they do? Well, first of all, I hope they spend the money that they now have because Kyle McCord left. That should be priority number one. But if they don't like the portal players, why not funnel that money into 2026 recruiting? I think it would really improve recruiting in general and specifically the 2026 class. And honestly, I would rather them try to get better high school players, not to say that the players they currently got are bad or anything, but I would rather them try to get better players out of high school than settling and overpaying for portal players. It just makes more sense. Now, look, if they feel that a portal player is worth the money, then by all means, go get the player because you still want to win in 2025. But if you don't feel he's worth it, funnel the money down to 2026 so you can get better players. And overall, it should improve the 2026 recruiting class. And here's why I think it's not only just a good idea, but also let's think about Fran Brown in Syracuse for a moment, all right? We know that Fran Brown is a really good recruiter. We know this because before Fran Brown took over, Syracuse was one of the worst recruiting teams in the ACC. It's not opinion, it's fact. You can, when you are done watching or listening to this podcast, feel free to go to 24/7 Sports and go look up the ACC team recruiting rankings in the years prior to Fran Brown arriving. They were consistently a bottom feeder. Some years they actually had the worst class in the conference. I'm not making it up. But since Fran Brown has taken over, they've stepped up their game a little bit. Now they're both years upper half, right? So obviously, Fran Brown's a really good recruiter. We know that. And he's a good recruiter because he can build relationships with these players. And building relationships is still important. But here's the deal. It doesn't matter how great of a recruiter you are if the money is simply not there. Period. Right? Players are not necessarily going to go always to the highest bidder. That's not what I am saying. What I am saying is when you're going after some of these players, you got to at least be in the ballpark for them to entertain a conversation. You got to be in the ballpark. Otherwise, why even consider? It's not just Syracuse, it's any program in general. You got to be in the ballpark in order to land these kids. And then that's where building relationships is really, really important. I'm going to give you guys an analogy, okay? The job analogy. Let's say you are very fortunate. You have 3 job offers. Congratulations. For the sake of argument, all 3 job offers are for similar roles. You're going to be doing identical things in all 3, no matter what position you take. You're going to be the senior vice president at one company. You're going to be the senior vice president at another company. You're going to be a senior vice president at another company. You can decide what it is, right? But let's say you got those 3 job offers, all with identical roles. One job offers you $100K salary. Another job, the second one, offers you a $90K salary. And the third job offers you a $50K salary. Which one are you taking? Which one are you crossing out? I'll tell you what I would do, okay? If I had 3 offers, now I'm not at this point in my career yet where I've ever had 3 job offers at one time, and hopefully one day I get there, but that's neither here nor there. Let's say I'm in this position. Let's say you are in this position. I would look at that $50K offer and probably write them off. I would probably write them off right away because they are not in the ballpark. I'm sorry. Why should we expect someone to take a 50% discount for an identical role? I would rule them out. Now, let's talk about job 1 and job 2. One is offering you $100K. Job 2 is offering you $90K. Job 1 is still going to have an advantage probably in your mind because, after all, it's the most money available. But I think logically, you would probably at least listen to job number 2's pitch to you. You probably listen. It's a pay cut, but it's not too much of a pay cut. You are in the ballpark. So you can get a player, you can get a job or whatever, or convince someone to take a job for slightly less money if you can build a better relationship. But it starts with being in the ballpark in the first place. Back to Syracuse, right? If Syracuse funnels the money from Kyle McCord into 2026 recruiting, well, now you got more money to play with. So if you're talking to a big-time recruit, which we know that Syracuse is talking to some of them, one of them being one of the best players in the country and another wide receiver, Calvin Russell. Calvin Russell is being pursued by pretty much every program in the country. And I would love for him to commit to Syracuse, but the money at least has to be somewhat there. It's got to be close. It's probably got to be in the ballpark, barring some unforeseen circumstance. If you can get into the ballpark, you could start building a relationship with a kid because you can have a legitimate chance of landing him. But on the flip side, back to the job analogy, if one job's offering you $50K and 2 other jobs are offering you $90 and $100K, you're probably not even going to consider the $50K job because why would you if you're going to be doing the same thing? Right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this phenomenon in the comments section below, but the bottom line is that with the Kyle McCord free money, I would certainly put it to good use. Either you get some good players in the portal in 2025, or if you feel like the value is just not there, put it into 2026 recruiting. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. As far as what is coming up on the podcast in the future, as expected, but still we'll go over it here on the podcast, either a mini podcast or a full podcast. We'll see depending on timing. Deuce Chestnut, a defensive back for the Orange, he announced that he is returning to Syracuse. Like I said, it was expected, but still good to hear. So we can talk about Deuce Chestnut and the defensive backs tomorrow. And then on Tuesday, Syracuse basketball is hosting Louisville at 7 p.m. Eastern, and there will be a full post-game reaction podcast. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On ACC podcast. Alex Dono and Kenton Gibbs, they keep it real and bring you the truth about where your favorite ACC team stands within the conference. You can find Locked On ACC on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this video, feel free to hit that like button. If you really liked it, subscribe to the channel, turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. Also, tell one or two of your closest Syracuse friends so that they can check out the podcast, and it'll help the channel grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. I will see you all again very soon.